This is part 3 of the first week's PowerPoint presentation. Again, a reminder that all images are from the public domain. And this will begin with Paul Revere. Paul Revere and the struggles in Boston. So Paul Revere and his famous midnight ride occurred on the eve of the Boston and Lexington conflict. So we have April 18, 1785. Just a reminder that this is about 5 years after the Boston Massacre. The Boston Massacre occurred in March of 1770. So about 5 years later, the Boston harbor is still occupied by the British, and we have Thomas Gage. General Gage, is in charge of the British military, and he has 750 British troops, and they leave Boston, and they are going to try to confiscate weapons they believe that are being housed and stored by the Lexington or the Concord Minutemen. And so the idea is that these British soldiers, led by Thomas Gage, are going to march and confiscate these weapons. And the famous story, one if by sea, one if by land, two if by sea. So Paul Revere is supposed to be sending word or sending a message, sending a signal to the various rebellious soldiers here, the American colonists, that the British are coming. And so this is the actual route. Now, as they arrive in Lexington and Concord, they do not find the weapons. On their retreat then, they are attacked by farmers, by the militiamen, and they retreat then back to Boston. That leads us then to Charleston and the battles of Boston and Charleston. This is a picture of Paul Revere. By April of 1775, Battle of Boston occurs, where we have Breed's Hill and Charleston, Bunker's Hill. All of these battles occur just outside of Boston, where our Minutemen, our Revolutionary War militiamen, have the high ground, and 6 times the British charge up the hill. Eventually, as in this picture, in this illustration, eventually the Redcoats are victorious, but after 6 charges against a much inferior enemy, the British finally do win, but 6 times gives the American colonists kind of a moral victory. Now, as we progress in time, look at May 1775, all of this early summer, late spring 1775. The Second Continental Congress gets together to talk about various responses and whether or not to respond with a Declaration of Independence, whether to respond with just another petition, a list of grievances. All of these are debated, and of course the Founding Fathers, John Adams, Samuel Adams, various Sons of Liberty, are adamant about blood being shed and the need for Declaration of Independence. The time for petitions and grievances is over, according to Samuel Adams and John Adams. I'm going to see if I can get this video to work. This is a YouTube video. I'm going to try to record this as well. Bear with me here.
I remind Mr. Rutledge and Mr. Duane that blood has been shed. Massachusetts blood. While we debate, our militia is left without munitions, without arms, without even the slightest encouragement.
Dickinson of Pennsylvania.
One colony cannot be allowed to take its sister colonies headlong into the maelstrom of war. Parliament will be eager to call a halt to hostilities, as are we. They will seek conciliation. We must offer them an olive branch. I move this assembly consider a humble and dutiful petition be dispatched to His Majesty, one that includes a plain statement that the colony desires immediate negotiation and accommodation of these unhappy disputes, and that we are willing to enter into measures to achieve that reconciliation. Second.
Mr. Dickinson. The time for negotiation is past. The actions of the British Army at Lexington and Concord speak plainly enough. If we wish to regain our natural-born rights as Englishmen, then we must fight for them.
I have looked for our rights in the laws of nature and can find them only in the laws of political society. I have looked for our rights in the Constitution of the English government and found them there. Our rights have been violated, Mr. Adams. That is beyond dispute. We must provide a plan to convince Parliament to restore those rights. Do we wish to become aliens to the mother country? No! No, gentlemen. We must come to terms with the mother country. No doubt the same ship which carries forth our list of grievances will bring back their redress.
Mr. Dickinson. My wife and young children live on the main road to Boston, fewer than 5 miles from the full might of the British Empire.
Should they sit and wait for Gage and his savages to rob them of their home, their possessions, their very lives? No, sir. Powder and artillery are the surest and most infallible conciliatory measures we can adopt.
If you exclude the possibility of peace, Mr. Adams, then I tell you no. You have blood on your hands.
And I tell you, Mr. Dickinson, that to hold out an olive branch to Britain is a measure of gross imbecility.
If you New England men continue to oppose our measures of reconciliation, you will leave us no choice but to break off from you entirely and carry on the opposition in our own way.
Here.
I sit in judgment on no man's religion, Mr. Dickinson. But your Quaker sensibilities do us a gross disservice, sir.
It is one thing to turn the other cheek, but to lie down on the ground like a snake and crawl toward the seat of power in abject surrender. Well, that is quite another thing, sir. And I have no stomach for it, sir. No stomach at all.
We will exhaust all peaceful approaches, Mr. Adams. And we will do it with or without the approbation of you and your Boston insurrectionists.
Hear, hear. Mr. Dickinson's motion to send an olive branch petition to His Majesty has been made and seconded. We shall proceed to a vote.
New Hampshire.
So that video is on YouTube. It says, "I have looked for our rights." It's John Adams' impassioned speech at the Second Continental Congress. And again, the Massachusetts delegation is very anxious for a declaration of independence. But there are others among the delegates that are very hesitant. The delegates from Pennsylvania, the delegates from the South as well. During this time, then, there are many others who want to kind of stir or fan the flames of fire for independence. Patrick Henry, gentlemen may cry peace, but there is no peace, there is war. Give me liberty or give me death. Of course, that's the famous quote from Patrick Henry. Thomas Paine then also is a famous orator, helps to fan the flames of independence with his writings. Thomas Paine, some of these quotes were actually during the Revolutionary War itself, especially "These are the times that try men's souls," and the summertime soldier and the sunshine patriot will in crisis shirk from the service of his country, but he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of men and women. Of course, a couple of other statements. Your government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. Famous quotes from Thomas Paine. So despite the Boston Massacre in 1770, despite the battles at Concord and Lexington and eventually at Charleston in 1775, despite the impassioned speech by John Adams, the Declaration of Independence is actually not signed until July 4th, 1776. It might be worth here to look at this. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaration of Independence is written by Thomas Jefferson and sent as a list of usurpations sent to the king, and this was unanimously declared so by the 13 colonies, July 4th, 1776. Benjamin Franklin sits in these various First and Second Continental Congresses, sits there as not necessarily a founding father, but many maybe label him as the founding grandfather. He was older, a different generation. He liked to come up with famous witticisms and famous sayings. One of the things that he said right after the Declaration of Independence is that, gentlemen, this is a solemn time, and we must all hang together, or we most assuredly will hang separately. This is to make sure everybody realizes that in the eyes of the British, this is a seditious and treasonous act, and that in the eyes of the British, in the eyes of the throne, all of these so-called founding fathers would be viewed as traitors. At this point, the war breaks out, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the war itself, but there are some famous things to call your attention to. Of course, the initial retreat from New York, Battle of Trenton, crossing of the Delaware. Crossing of the Delaware here, the famous pose by George Washington. Please take time to read about those events in your textbook. Some other things to look at: the British disaster at Saratoga, and then eventually Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown. Finally, the war is over. The war is over in 1783. It's worth noting that the war starts technically July 4th, 1776. So 1776 to 1783. It's a fairly long war. Battles weren't fought continuously. Wars were fought a little bit different 225 years ago. Take breaks during the winter. But war was officially in session for this whole time. And some of the famous personalities of the war, of course, we have General George Washington. His number one assistant was Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was a very effective and brave soldier. we have Green, and we have Francis Marion, Nathaniel Green and Francis Marion, and then also we have these two individuals. Some think that the character in the movie Patriot with Mel Gibson was kind of loosely based off of these two individuals. We have the famous French Marquis de Lafayette, and he was very helpful to George Washington, especially being kind of a go-between between the French Navy and General George Washington, and the indispensable Baron von Steuben, who was very helpful in helping George Washington get some discipline and some training to his ragtag group of militiamen. That concludes the PowerPoint presentation, parts 1, 2, and 3 for chapters 7 and 8. Please don't hesitate to email if you have any questions. We will begin the next chapter PowerPoint with the development of the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation.